Welcome to episode 45 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Theresa Warburton. She is a scholar who focuses on the intersections of literature and social movements. Dr. Warburton is co-editor of Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers with Alyssa Washuta. Dr. Warburton's latest book is Other Worlds Here, Honoring Native Women's Writing in Contemporary Anarchist Movement. In this episode, Theresa speaks on collaboration, literature, nationalism, and discussions on contemporary anarchism. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
Silver Threads, Still Walking, Still Waking is co-hosted by me, Carla Bergman.
And me, Eleanor Goldfield. This is where we interview long-term organizers and radicals about their watershed moments, what they've learned along the way, and how they maintain their hope on this path, dreaming and building emergent worlds for a present and future anchored in justice and freedom for all.
Because there are forks in the road, but they all lead us home, to the fight, to the build.
I had read in your book that you moved from Colorado to Massachusetts as a kid, and you mentioned in your book how Massachusetts is one of the first indigenous words you knew. I was wondering, can you explain a moment or a part of a process when you started to see through the propaganda of colonial society and started questioning these power structures?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that I didn't really have a sense of that sort of seeing through things until I got a little bit older. And that, like, I'm thinking about in high school, just like learning about some of the history of the region in Massachusetts and thinking about, well, that history doesn't sort of line up with itself, like some of the narratives of Thanksgiving. I think probably learning about the sort of pushback against the holiday of Thanksgiving, the National Day of Mourning that they do in Plymouth, the American Indians of New England put on, was one of the first times that I sort of learned to question the stories that are told. And that's how I really think of it, as like the narratives that were told about the United States and sort of how those stories get perpetuated and what values get perpetuated through them. That there were a lot of times that I started hearing other stories that had different values. And that, I think, made me sort of question a lot of the stories I'd been told.
So it started kind of breaking those narratives apart. And yeah, definitely being in Massachusetts with the Day of Mourning that they do.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and just thinking about, like, I think a lot of my sort of political education started happening through punk music when I was young. And so a lot of the narratives that punks talked about were a lot different than, narratives about the United States just in general. What was it as a country were a lot of different, they were just very different narratives than I had been told. And that was a big learning process for me.
Yeah, and music is just such an amazing conveyor of information and knowledge. And I really liked the hardcore quote you mentioned in the end of your book too, on how if it can hold me, it can hold all of us. And just really the powerful use of that term. And maybe you could add on to that. And also, how did you, or when did you start becoming familiar with anarchism or anarchy?
I think, those two things are connected for me, because music was so much the first thing that I really became, even if it wasn't sort of connecting me to anarchism sort of proper, like introducing me to, Kropotkin or Bakunin, it was introducing me to the sort of models of anarchism that I came to recognize later. So like just being in punk communities where people would do like benefit shows if something happened, like to a community member, or if something was going on in their community, like doing benefit shows as a form of mutual aid, like seeing that play out, or seeing consensus-based decision-making in bands, like as just basic premises that, or values that I was taught like in those spaces. And even though I think I didn't quite recognize them as anarchism at the time, like it wasn't necessarily expressed that way. It's what I've come to understand as like anarchist practices. And that was a way that I learned how to just sort of be with other people in good ways. And that's what I really think about anarchism being on its most basic level is, how do we exist with each other in good ways that benefit all of us. And that was something I learned from those sort of music communities, and also just a lot of the really politically oriented music that I was into at that time and still am into. I think like taught me a lot about anarchism, that just introduced me to this idea that there was a thing called anarchism, and it was something that was like accessible to me and not something that was like scary or out there, but it was something that was in here that I could be part of.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's my favorite type of anarchism too, like a little a anarchism of just ways that it shows up and you're already immersed in it, and it's not something that's so rigid or something else that would become more activist-y, I guess.
Yeah, that's really important to me. Like the idea that we need to have, I think there needs to be some idea of what anarchism is, but that we can't be so rigid that we end up sort of pushing a lot of people out.
My next question is if you could speak about the power of collaborating on writing or even collective writing. I love the story of when you met Elisa Washuda and you were both wearing the same clothes. and the book you both edited, Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers, and how you used a basket as a structure or form for the book.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration was so, I think, wonderful to have that book come out before my solo book, because the collaboration was really where so much of that book took shape. Like the shape of that book was really from Alyssa and I's relationship, I think. And that I think of it like it really is a commitment to a lifetime of working together. And doing that collaboration together was a project where we had to learn a lot about how, just thinking about labor, like how to divide up labor in a really equitable way. And especially thinking about Alyssa as a Native scholar and writer, and me as a non-Native scholar and writer, like what sorts of responsibilities do we want to put on each other? What sorts of responsibilities should I be taking on? How do we want to sort of present the work? And how does the collaboration sort of impact the work that's happening was a big question that we talked about a lot. And it's not, it's a collaboration between Alyssa and I, but it's really a collaboration between us and all of the writers also. And I think that was just a really important part of it. To do an anthology, I think, is such a different experience than doing a monograph. And I have to say I prefer it. It feels like this like multivocal project that doesn't really need to make any comment that's like singular, and actually has room for all of these diverse opinions and perspectives, but is able to do that in a single object. And I think that was really important to both of us.
Yeah, and they're really hard to do a edited book or an anthology well, and it's such an important work because it highlights so many different voices, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And that was really what we were thinking about, was like, and a lot of the things that are in the book were previously published in magazines or other sort of literary journals. And part of what we were interested in was saying, there's so much going on out there, really. And there's so much like interesting nonfiction work happening. And why, if we can just bring it together in one place and just really have something that's like, it's just like a shot in time kind of what it looks like right now, that would be really useful. And having people be able to access it in one place. We talked a lot about access and thinking about how to get these works in conversation with each other so that people could see those conversations happening.
Yeah, definitely. And really just breaking open the whole concept of what is already published or what is out, in kind of this, I don't know, like a capitalist narrative of something always wanting to be new or fresh or something. And with the internet and media, people don't always see things that are out. So repackaging or repurposing things and putting them together, reweaving them is so cool, because I hadn't seen a lot of these writings either.
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't thought of it that way. Like that we were reweaving them into this, and I think that the way that we did it would hopefully, even if people had encountered these essays before, help them see them in different ways, because there's so many facets to the essays that I still teach a lot of the essays when I teach Native and Indigenous Lit, and students get something new from it every time. And so it's really amazing to see, even when these things are brought together, it doesn't mean they're not alive. It doesn't mean they're not still sort of producing different kinds of knowledges just by being in the world. And that's been really exciting to see.
Yeah, I love highlighting contemporary writers as well. I feel that's something that June Jordan does so well. And Felicia Rose Chavez as well always highlights that.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially for Native literature, when a lot of folks are taught about Native lit or Native people just in the past. Mm-hmm. And this is really a way to emphasize that these are like new and innovative things that Native authors are doing right now, and really counters that narrative about the past and about the future too, and our ideas about who exists in the future.
Definitely. Well, thank you. I'd like to discuss your book, Other Worlds, here now,
sure.
Honoring Native women's writing in contemporary anarchist movements. And I just wanted more on the framing of the book. I was maybe misreading it of what you mean when you say new anarchism or anarchism in your book. Mm-hmm. And I know you said that the term is referencing kind of new anarchism from the Graeber 1999 W2Yale movement into Occupy. And then also along with the term settler anarchism, which you define as a model of anarchist politics that reifies the structure of settlement within its own political philosophy. And I was wondering, do you see your work as an intervention into so-called U.S. and Canadian white settler anarchism?
Yeah, definitely. That's really what I'm, as a person who grew up in the United States and has lived on the U.S.-Canada border for the past 10 years and has been, at different times, different amounts of related to the movements that I'm talking about. I think what I'm really interested in is this kind of anarchism that became really more popular in the United States in that sort of, alter globalization or global justice movement time period, with the protests against the WTO being this like really interesting story that is told as this sort of beginning of that form of new anarchism. And what I was really interested in was like not a really sort of simple critique of saying like, well, anarchism has this history, this European history. Like I don't think that's like necessarily this disqualifying thing, but I think we need to think about what happens when it sort of jumps the pond, and how is it different when it becomes, rooted in US politics or in the history of the United States. And that's something that I sort of saw happening with new anarchism, is this way that it's really becoming engaged in not like a US centric necessarily, because it was and still is, I think, a very global movement, but which is really rooted in like thinking about US politics and thinking about US political imagination. And so that I was really interested in that sort of era of anarchism, because it's this era, I think, where there was this like much more intense interest in anarchism, and it really developed into something a little bit different than we'd seen in, the late 19th and early 20th centuries also. Yeah,
and how I see that earlier anarchism being really tied to what you talk about, nationalism and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I have a question later about nationalism, but how it was really tied to U.S. anarchism was really tied to that. And I saw it as kind of you breaking open with settler anarchism, the whiteness that implies of anarchism in a lot of scenes. But when I say that, I also don't want to contribute to any erasure of the work of Black, Indigenous, and all non-white anarchists globally, such as, the Maroon movement in DC and Baltimore, Indigenous Action, who's also part of the Channel Zero network. And as you mentioned in your book, William Anderson and Lorenzo Irving and Jonina Irving and Ashanti Alston. So when we're discussing a lot of these critiques, and also in your book, you're talking about settler anarchism in that moment. Okay.
And I can say too, like, that's exactly was my concern as well. Like that in talking about settler anarchism, like I don't want to ignore the long histories of anarchisms from communities of color and from indigenous communities. Also, my sort of question about it when I was going into the book was why hasn't this sort of transformed the basis of anarchism in this, like in Occupy, for instance? Like if there's been so much engagement from indigenous anarchists and Black anarchists, why does the anarchism of Occupy look sort of similar, or why are there some of the same sort of problems with the like approach of Occupy that there were during the alter globalization movement or global justice movement? You know, if we want to take seriously the sort of interventions that anarchists of color are making and indigenous anarchists are making, that's going to require a really transformative look at, you know, what anarchism is and what we consider it to be.
Yeah, and I really like the methodology and stuff that you broke into on the Battle of Seattle, or the battle in Seattle, and these kind of how you went into the canon on this anarchist canon, and broke that open, which is so important. I really loved this intervention, and I learned a lot from it. And talking about how Other Worlds here, quote, emerges from a desire to center a place-based method of engagement in our anarchist inquiries. And you do highlight that your theory does not theorize a new way of understanding place, but broadens the term. And adding on to that, I was wondering if you could speak more about the 1856 Battle of Seattle and how you pivoted in context with how the 1999 WTO battle in Seattle is framed.
Yeah, I mean, this was just a really interesting thing that happened to me while I was like researching the book. And part of what happened when I was doing research for the book, you know, this was originally my dissertation project. And so, but it went through a lot of revision, partly because I moved from where I was doing grad school in Haudenosaunee territory in Buffalo to the Pacific Northwest, where I got a job on Lummi and Coast Salish territory in Bellingham. And so I was the project had to change a little bit because I was in a different place. And so part of what I was doing with this chapter is, you know, learning about the region and having moved to the Pacific Northwest, learning about the region. And I was doing all of this research about anarchism and noticing that, and especially about new anarchism, and noticing that all of these books usually started with the story of the 1999 battle in Seattle. And that was like this sort of requisite. And I say in the book too, my book also begins with that, right? So it's sort of funny. But then when I was learning about the history of the region, I learned about this Battle of Seattle in 1856, which was part of the what's sometimes called the treaty wars in the area. And at the time, Seattle, you know, was a settlement in Washington territory. And it wasn't a huge battle, but it was a battle where I think the usual narrative of it is that it was an attack by Native people upon the settlement of Seattle. And then the sort of settler people were supported by the Marines from the United States Navy. And that was a ship called the Decatur that was anchored in Elliott Bay. And there's a lot of stuff around Seattle that's named after the ship, after Decatur. And it became this really important story for settlers that it was this instance supposedly where they'd been attacked and had to fight back. And so it became this sort of narrative about, you know, the dangers of the frontier and about the sort of victory of settlers in this sort of fight against Native people in the time. And I just was, you know, I thought it was interesting that it had the same name, that like this battle is known as the Battle of Seattle. That's how it's referred to in history books. That's how, you know, if you Google it, if you're looking on Wikipedia, like that's what it's called. And that there was no sort of engagement with that sort of battle in the Battle of Seattle in 1999 was, to me, I was like, they're just on a most basic level. I was like, they're called the same thing. It seems like it might get confusing at some point. But then on a deeper level, it started getting me to think about, well, how did the activism of the 99 battle in Seattle engage with place and engage with the fact that it wasn't a coincidence that that happened in Seattle, that those protests happened in Seattle. And what is the sort of history of settlement in the region that is the literal foundation of these protests as well? And how are people engaging with that? And so that, I became more interested in the relationship between those two battles for that reason. Like there's that really basic sense that, yes, they're called the same thing, but also one is really part of the reason why Seattle is a city and why Seattle was a place that could have a massive protest like they did in 99.
Yeah, and it highlights like the violence that it took to make Seattle like this.
Right.
And when reading a lot about the 1999 battle in Seattle, sometimes some of the narratives would go back to the IWW fight when the police attacked them in 1919. And was it Everett? I believe it was Everett. But I never had seen this connection you make, which is so important. And you bring up this is what happens when a prominent story of radical nativity is told and retold without a commitment to place. And it's really important.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, that's really and part of it is just, like I said, my attempt to sort of get to know place and figure out my place where I was, to figure out what it meant to be an anarchist in, Western Washington in the 2010s when I moved there. Like what sort of histories was I part of and what sort of, responsibilities did I have then? And so I'm still sort of asking those questions, but that's part of moving to a new place. And it really changed the book for me moving across the country. And so it was a really interesting process for sure.
And you also tied in the macaw whaling controversy in 1999. And you had written about how many animal rights and right-wing people aligned to be anti-native when whaling was allowed. And the story about Ben White, who was involved in the WTO protests and was also going against the macaw whale hunt, was really illuminating as well.
Yeah, and I think that Ben White was such an amazing activist, and the work that he did for the 99 protest was so amazing. And and I think I even mentioned that the sort of turtle brigade that he was part of, that one of those costumes is now in the Smithsonian as part of like an exhibit about the protests. And so like, it's really sort of that narrative is really central to those protests, but I think there's also, and I got sort of turned on to this argument from a colleague of mine named Zoltan Grossman, who is a professor at the Evergreen State College. And he came and saw a presentation that I did about the two battles of Seattle at a conference. And he said, you should look into the macaw whaling controversy because that's part of what was going on at the time. And there's not a lot of discussion of, how Native people might have been feeling about, activism from non-Native people at the time. And when I found out, that Ben White was part of that group of opposing the macaw whaling controversy, it was just this really interesting, like, connection that made me think a lot about what was going on in Washington at the time. And that controversy is still very controversial. I mean, Paul Watson of the Sea Shepherd just came out with a new book, particularly about the macaw whaling controversy. So it's still something that is very just, I think controversial is the best word, but it is not sort of part of the conversation about the WTO protests in a way that I think doesn't really recognize the history of the place or the things that were going on at the time.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that open. And then you did, when you went to Occupy Wall Street, you pivoted that very nicely with Joanne Barker's talking about how Zuccotti Park had left out the Lenape history in large part in a lot of the historians who've written about Occupy haven't talked about this. Yeah. And how the whole name of Wall Street was named after a wall built by the Dutch to prevent Lenape people attacking these colonizers in the place. So it's also really important intervention as well. And a lot that wasn't getting spoken about in a lot of Occupy movements. I know everywhere is different and the history is not so well recorded. Just to give an example, in Denver, in so-called Denver, where I'm from, the homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, at the Occupy encampment, AIM was part of it as well. And some movements came and immediately started talking about the term occupy as a colonizer term and something that Columbus did. And Occupy Denver came and had I think they joined together to acknowledge that it would be a decolonial movement of Occupy Denver. But yeah, a thing that happened so much that it just became a really problematic term.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of instances like the ones you're talking about that are really exciting, like ways that even from the beginning, people were questioning that use of the term occupy and just thinking about like, what do we want these movements to look like? And I hope that my work doesn't discount some of that activism. I think what I'm concerned with is these sort of overarching narratives. So the way that I'm really interested in how stories get retold. And the way that's why I was interested in, the Battle of Seattle in 99, that part of what I was doing was I'm not sort of talking about what happened on the ground as much because there were lots of Indigenous people there and there were lots of people, the Indigenous Environmental Network was there and Tom Goldtooth gave a talk at the WTO protest and there was that kind of involvement. But my sort of interest is in, okay, well, how does that get written into the sort of history that we talk about? And that's like you're mentioning the history of Occupy is still being written. And the part of what I'm interested in is, how do we tell that in a really honest way and say, even from the beginning, there was this question about the use of the term occupy instead of getting into a sort of like a fight, essentially. Like, I'm not trying to fight with anybody, basically. Yeah. And I think that there's the way that those narratives get told is really interesting to me, and the way that the story gets retold, like the story of Occupy. And we still call it that, and it's still, I just want to make sure that those sort of the conversations that happened, like the one you're talking about in Denver, that becomes part of the narrative. Like that becomes part of the way that we talk to people who weren't there about what happened, because I think that's how the sort of institutional memory of it is maintained.
Yeah, and the way that I'm reading your work and critiques is it seems like you're going more after this anarchist canon or anarchist history of way things are being framed. And like you said, that's not the everyday lowercase anarchy that's going on. And also your intervention into those canons or more known histories are also an intervention into a form of settler anarchism, because the people who are, quote, seen as the authority of history of these movements, or even the people getting published and recognizing these histories that get studied, usually are being published due to benefiting from white supremacy or whiteness in a lot of regards.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I'm thinking about the work too, is that I want anarchism to be successful. And I want us to, and I use us throughout the book. I say I throughout the book. I really include myself in this, body of work that I'm talking about. And what I want is for us to have these difficult conversations about settlements so that we can get to a place where our activism, our scholarship, our organizing is really undoing the structures of the state and capital in like real ways. And the structure of the US state is a little bit different than the structures of European states, the way that, canonical anarchist thinkers were talking about. And we need to be really thoughtful about that in the contemporary moment.
Yeah, thank you. My next question was kind of about the discussion between anti-colonialism and decolonization, and how settler anarchism, like many parts of academia, are kind of falling into using decolonizing a lot. And in your book, you had used the term or the sentence in the context of this chapter that there can be no decolonization within a settler state. I think that's a really important term, and also kind of this nuance that I was kind of trying to talk about. Wondering if you had thoughts on that, on the word anti-colonialism compared to decolonization, and kind of how these are being watered down.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of complicated feelings about it, partly because I'm in the, a white non-native scholar in the academy doing this work. And that's not, everything of who I am, but that's, what I do on the regular, like that's my job. And so I think a lot about like what decolonization can look like. I think about a lot of the ways that it's been appropriated to be a sort of non-radical approach. And I think of radical in the sense of like really returning to the root of the problem and really transformative. And so the way that, like, to me, something that's decolonial, it can't be decolonial without critiquing the state. Like, it's just not, to me, that's one of the roots of colonization, is the creation of the U.S. settler state. And so without a critique of that, I don't see how we can get to a decolonized standpoint. And I think that there's a lot of work that attempts to do that, to sort of rectify. And this is like a more liberal approach, I think, than a radical approach. I have so many feelings about it. Yeah, there just can be no decolonization without that sort of critique of the state, and without thinking about the material return of land, the return of material resources. And that just because something is anti-colonial, like is against colonization, doesn't mean that it's necessarily doing the work of undoing that colonization. And I think we need to be clear about those two different processes, that there could be a critique of colonization, but we also need to sort of build up something else in its place.
And then I was wondering if you could maybe just break open a little bit more on the thoughts on gender and sexuality, gender binary and hierarchy, and how those are usually brought up, but sometimes it's not parsed with settler colonialism. And I believe you tied this to Mark Rifkin's term, the stability of the given.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of really interesting work coming out of anarchist studies and just anarchist scholarship about gender and sexuality. And it's been, I think, a really great way that anarchism has been transformed in a lot of ways, is by like the prevalence of anarchist feminism and thinking about the influence of like radical gender politics on anarchist movements. I think there's a lot of really good like symbiotic relationships there between those movements. I don't think that there's, is exactly like you're saying, as much of a connection between the gender dimensions of settlement, and that, I think in the book, part of what I was trying to get at was that there are some of the most sort of pertinent issues regarding gender and sexual violence are related to settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is this gendered and sexual process. And it has been since the beginning. And that if we can't see the sort of connections between those things, then we end up not actually addressing the root of the issues. And I think that there's, when we think about some of the stuff that radical gender politics are trying to do, like break open this idea of binaries, not just the gender binary, but just the idea of like how we use binaries as a political or even cultural tool. And I think that's really useful for thinking about settler colonialism as well, thinking about how did this binary, when I teach this, my students are always like, well, how did this happen? Is basically their question. Like they just are like so horrified by the fact that this exists, by, you don't need to convince them of that sort of aspect of it. But then they're sort of questioning, well, how did this system get set up? And I think colonialism is often one of the ways that I talk about, well, this was a really important part of how the gendered binary became so essential to American politics, to American culture, is because it was really essential to settlement, to things like who's going to own land. That the gender binary was really important to being able to set up a really white supremacist patriarchal structure for land ownership and the theft of native land. And so those things were really, that's just one example of the way that those two things are really deeply connected. And I want us to be able to see those connections so that as we're working towards or working against things like settlement, we can also make sure that we know that gender and sexuality are part of that.
Thank you. Thanks for breaking that open. I really liked the part of where you were breaking open Janet Rogers' critique in honor of Ginsburg's How. And I kind of saw this as a way, a lot of critical theory uses, I think the term is creolization, where they may take like Rousseau and Fanon and compare their works and find some good conversations between them. And I felt this was really similar in a way that it doesn't create erasure, but it also calls to task like those problems with maybe Ginsburg or the Beat Generation. You know, this is just an example. And you had said it reckons with the tension at the heart of Other Worlds here, how we can honor the formative influence of radical politics while simultaneously addressing the way such politics reproduce the structure of the U.S. settler state.
Yeah.
And I really liked this section. I was wondering if you had any comments or more to add on this topic.
I mean, I just love Janet Rogers' work. And I thought that this poem, you know, when I was young, Howl was so influential to me, you know, and like just reading some of those radical beat poets and, you know, people that were sort of counterculture, it was really influential to me to learn about those folks and to think about the idea of there being a counterculture in general as something that is like built up and something that you can be part of. And I was, you know, starting to be part of my own counterculture or countercultural groups and thinking about, you know, what that meant to exist in a society where you were sort of in this weird relationship to it, where you were like working against a lot of the structures of it. And I think what's so interesting about Janet Rogers' poem is that she's both, exactly like you said, acknowledging Ginsburg as a sort of literary ancestor while also critiquing the work at the same time. And I think that is such an act of love in some ways, that's really what I wanted to do on a bigger scale in the book, was to say, like, I am indebted to anarchist politics for everything about basically who I am and the values that I have and the ethics that I have. And that's how I learned how to be a person that, like, I can wake up in the morning and be okay with who I am, is through engaging with these countercultures and through anarchist politics. But so in that sense, that's sort of part of my history. But at the same time, there's also the fact that me knowing that group so well and being part of groups like that enables me to do this sort of loving, I mean, I think of it as a sort of loving critique that is like, hey, how can we do this better? And like, what are the core problems that we see now that we've been in it for all this time together, and we've built these structures so that we're in it together? How do we like work through that? And I think Janet Rogers' work in general is really trying to do that through poetry, and really trying to think about how do we sort of deal with the things that we inherit, knowing that it's not just about saying I disavow myself of any of this history. You know, she doesn't say like, fuck Allen Ginsberg, I'm never going to read him, that's useless. She's like, Howl is important, and she wants to engage with that, but also critique it at the same time. And I think that's a form of this loving critique that is really about, like that quote that you said, like holding both things at the same time and being able to live in that sort of contradiction for a little bit.
Yeah. Thanks for breaking that open. Yeah, I know Bill Hooks had mentioned a lot on critique being a form of love, and yeah, it's so important because it doesn't just go into, well, we found one thing wrong, we're going to erase that, like the erasure. Like it's important to build on top of it and have these discussions because things are messy.
Yes.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that what you're saying about not sort of throwing something out is really important to me. Like it was important to me with the book to say, like, what I'm trying to do is bolster anarchism. What I'm trying to do is make it a more appealing and exciting and useful political model, instead of saying like, you know what, like this is a colonial whatever and we don't want to use it anymore. Like that's not sort of the approach that I've taken. And I think that it's a different kind of critique that's really enabled through anarchist politics. Like I actually think that this kind of critique is at the heart of what anarchism does. Like it's why we have consensus-based decision making. Is not, you know, if you expected everybody to always agree, why would you need a model that worked out differences? Like you wouldn't need that. And part of what we have is this model where we expect critique, and we expect it to be engaged in this way that is about moving the project forward, about moving us forward in productive ways. And I think that's the work I hope the book can do in the world.
Yeah, and that definitely comes through in your book. And I really liked the part where you said, my critique is fundamentally rooted in my belief that anarchism contains within its structures the possibility for such a transformation of, breaking open anarchist logics and having more of a critique or reflection on land and place. My next question was, you started the chapter on Vine Deloria Jr., saying from an Indian point of view, it's all foreign policy. And you had a discussion on nationalism in here. And the way I had seen it was that in some activist circles, some may say that all nationalism is bad or something. And your book really showed that this creates a form of erasure in Benedict Anderson's work. And it creates a form of racism. And you had quoted the Haudenosaunee and how they have their nationalism, which was prior to European modernity. This goes back to 1722, compared to Benedict Anderson had said that the genealogy of nationalisms is not tied only to European modernity, but to the colonial demarcation of North America as the New World. I was wondering if you could speak more about that. I thought that was a really important point.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I have it was one of this is like some of the oldest part of the book. So some of the book got really rewritten from the dissertation piece, but this was something that was in the dissertation because it was something that living on Haudenosaunee territory and like working with Haudenosaunee people that I realized like it didn't make sense within an anarchist framework because there was so much sort of anti-nationalism and anti-American nationalism, right? Like anti-patriotism. And there was this way that nationalism became synonymous with American nationalism in a way that didn't sort of seem to honor the idea of native nations as nations whose concept of nationalism doesn't come from the same roots as the sort of, Treaty of Westphalia, modern state sort of narrative of nationalism that I think some anarchists were working with. And it's not, and what I tried to show in the book too, and in that chapter is that it's not a foregone conclusion what nationalism is in Native studies. Like it's actually a really big conversation and debate about what kind, and, using the plural nationalisms and like, what does Native nationalism or Native nationalisms look like? Part of what I was trying to argue is that we can't even sort of understand that conversation within the framework that we have. And so it's not so much as, I don't think what I was trying to argue is saying like, oh, this nationalism just predates American nationalism and it's proof that, it was created somewhere else. But to say that actually there are these really complicated discussions about what nationalism looks like that we can't even have in anarchist spaces if we don't acknowledge that there are these other ways of looking at nationalism beyond the nation state. And it's a really big part of, especially being in the Pacific Northwest too, where we have a lot of treaties, and recognizing that one of the first things that treaties indicate is that Native nations are nations. They're sovereign nations, that the US government only makes treaties with sovereign nations. And so then that brings up this really, interesting question for anarchists about how we're going to deal with the fact that nationalism is an important part of a lot of Native sovereignty movements. And how do we deal with that on a level when nationalism has historically in anarchist politics been really frowned upon and been something that, anarchists have said that we're against? Like, how do we deal with that conversation then? I'm not 100% sure. Like that's part of what I would love to open up space to have more of those conversations.
Yeah, the chapter definitely broke open that conversation and it came through with that. And thank you for your answer to my question. It made my question make more sense to me too.
Awesome. Yeah.
I really liked the last chapters on Leslie Marmon Selko. And I loved just the interventions that you did and kind of the different readings of Selko's work and your reading of her poem and disrupting settler theories of the Bering Strait thing that always comes up of migration, discussing writing on turtle shells and Turtle Island, and how you had discussed how Selko brings the Laguna Pueblo and the Yupik to forefront instead of U.S. settler borders. And was just wondering if you could maybe talk more about this chapter or some things that you really found interesting. You also had went into, believe it looked like some archive or personal letters as well, and just some things you found surprising or interesting from that.
Yeah, this was it was an interesting chapter to write, and it's a brand new one. So whereas the sort of stuff about nationalisms was in the dissertation and was something I was thinking about early, this became something that came in much later to the book. And I think I was looking for a way to end it that dealt with this sort of global question. And to be honest with you, I can't remember why I decided to do why I decided to work in the archives in Leslie Silko's papers. I think it was because I learned that I had gone to Alaska because I had moved to the Pacific Northwest, and all of a sudden Alaska was very close. And so I had gone on a trip to southeastern Alaska, and I brought Ceremony with me because it had been a while since I read it. I'd read it in grad school, but I was thinking about teaching it again. And the edition that I had was a very early edition. And so I was going on this trip. I didn't want to bring this early edition with me, so I bought a new one. And it was this new one that had, and it's the version that I work with a lot in the chapter, that it had this introduction where she talks about having written most of the book in Alaska. And I just thought that was so interesting that because it's such a place-based book, and it's so much about the desert and about Laguna Pueblo and about that area. And I thought, what an interesting, just like little tidbit that she had written this book and then in the intro, she talks about how she had written it while in Alaska. And part of what she was doing was that she missed the desert so much that she was trying to write something that would bring her back there while she was in Alaska. And so that was just so fascinating to me. I just thought, I didn't know that she had spent time in Alaska. I didn't know that she had written this, her most famous book while she was there. And so I went to the archives to sort of look for earlier versions of Ceremony to see if there were if there was any indication there, or to sort of just understand that relationship better, what had it been like for her to write this while she had spent time in Alaska. And when I got into her archives, I found, actually, I thought, what was just a really compelling sense that when she was in Alaska, she was really thinking about the Pacific as a place. And I thought that was just so fascinating, to see the way that she was making these connections between Alaska and Japan, and then also looking at and being clear about the fact that there were so many different nations, native nations in Alaska, and that she was trying to stage this conversation between not sort of native people and the US government, but between native people across these sort of, or indigenous people sort of across the world. Yeah. And it was my first experience doing sort of archival research in somebody's letters. And it was a very intimate, experience, and very strange in some ways to be reading them. But I found lots of cool things that I ended up using, including the image that's the sort of epigraph to the book. I found that during my archival research. And yeah, it made me look at the book in a whole different way. And it was so exciting to see those sort of personal elements of what she does and what she did for that book, because it's such a big, important book. If you Google, most important Native literature, that book is on almost every list. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do something different with it. And I was just fascinated by the fact that she had been in Alaska while she was writing it. I don't know if you've been to Southeast Alaska, but the weather is almost the complete opposite of a desert. It just rains constantly.
Oh, wow. No, I never have. And yeah, I liked it. I liked the letter you had found. That you put in the book. That was really cool to read the letter. And then I really liked how you mentioned how while writing Ceremony, she recovered from debilitating headaches. Mm-hmm. And as she healed along with the main character, Tayo, and crossed vast space through her literary journey. That was really cool.
Yeah. And that was some of the most fun stuff I'm not I work on contemporary literature mostly, as you can tell in the book. And so I don't do a whole lot of archival research, but that was like this very exciting trend for me to just be there with someone's letters is, like I said, it's just very intimate, and to hear, like, to be able to reproduce some of that for the reader, to see like what she was thinking about at the time, and, you know, how she was talking about her time there was really exciting for me.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that story. And then my last question is kind of, what are you working on next? And also like anarchism and joy, like what are you seeing that excites you?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with that one. I work at a college, and I work with mostly, you know, we have a lot of students that are mostly between the ages of 18 and 24, 25. And I've just been seeing, like, during COVID, watching the students sort of show up for each other and develop. I've watched a lot of the students develop mutual aid networks. So we have a couple different mutual aid networks for Western in specific, and for Whatcom County students. And watching that has really given me a lot of joy, and seeing the way that young people that I work with are like showing up for each other and engaging in these, like, a model of mutual aid that I think, not that we didn't do that when I was young, but I think it's so much more mainstream in a way now, that the idea of like supporting each other is very common and very central to the sort of social dimensions of what I see my students doing. And it makes me feel like being more supportive in my, like, I can feel my pedagogy changing. I can feel the way that I interact with students changing, that I see ways of being more supportive of the work that they're doing. And I think that that's really exciting to see all of those, like, these conversations become more mainstream, and see these practices become more mainstream as like and I don't mean sort of more accepted, but I mean like just as a basic good, you know, that people see mutual aid as a basic good, like that. Why wouldn't we do that? I think is a really exciting thing to witness. And I'm sort of thinking now about two different projects. One is, one of the things that I wish that I had done a little bit better in the book was to think critically about the category of woman and women's writing. And, you know, so to build on that, I would like my next project to be, I'm working on something about queer Native writing and sort of gender and genre, and the way that queer Native writers are really playing with genre as a way of also playing with gender. And so I'm really interested in folks like Billy Ray Belcourt and Leanne Simpson, Ariel Twist, the way that these authors are, and like Jay Simpson, who does performance art as well as poetry, and just thinking about the way that these queer Native creators are refusing the sort of not only gender binary and gender boundaries, but are refusing genre binaries. Like they won't just be a poet or a novelist or a performance artist, but actually they move, and sometimes even in one text, there's all different kinds of genres. So I'm thinking of, you know, a more sort of academic project that deals with that. But I'd also like to write more like a trade book about Native literature in a way that is much, you know, more accessible than an academic book. Because I think that one of the things about the book that is, I think, one of the core arguments that I wanted to make is that literature is important. And I do this activity with my students on the first day of class where I ask them a question like, how many of you have had your worldview or your life changed by something you've read? And almost everybody always raises their hand. There's always one or two that their lives haven't been changed by something they've read, I guess. But, you know, I think even if it's something that you read as a child, a lot of us have had literature change the way that we look at the world. And I think that that's so significant. And it speaks to how important literature should be in our movements. And I think it's getting better in anarchism. Like AK Press has the new series that Adrienne Marie Brown's book is part of. That's a series of literary.
Grievers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Grievers. And I'm trying to remember what the name of the series is. It'll come to me. The Black Dawn series. That's it.
Yeah. And Margaret Killjoy too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think there's some really exciting ways that literature is becoming more of a part of the discussion, but I'd love to contribute to that through a more accessible book about Native literature that's sort of about why Native literature is important today. And, I'm working on a couple different things about it, but like connecting it to things like environmental movements, but also things like basketball. Like I have a chapter in mind about basketball and poetry that I think will be fun to write.
Oh, awesome. I'm a big basketball fan. So.
Oh, me too.
I went to read that. I read, did you read that poem by Ross Gay?
Yes, Beholding.
Yes, it's all about Dr. J. It blew my mind.
It blew my mind. I just finished it before I came on this trip, and it was so awesome. Yeah. And there's so much history. I actually just read this book called Brothers on Three that's about a basketball team on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. And it's got me thinking about, the history of basketball. And basketball is really important in a lot of Native communities and on a lot of reservations. And just thinking about, I think I want the chapter to be about Natalie Diaz, who's this amazing poet. She just won the Pulitzer. And she was a basketball player before she was a poet. And she talks a lot about the sort of connections that she sees between things like pace and rhythm and, working with the body that are important in basketball and are also important in literature. And so I want to make connections to things like that so that people can see that literature actually does work in the world that's really significant, and it can do things to us. Like, Ross Gay's book, you can think about basketball in this really intense way about history and genealogy and politics. And I'd like to do something. I can't do what Ross Gay does, but I would like to do something that made it accessible to people like my parents, who are so sweet and will read my academic book, but it might not resonate with them.
Cool. Thank you. And do you also make music as well? I wasn't being nosy, but in one YouTube talk, I saw a bunch of guitars behind you.
Yes, I do. I was actually, I was in a band with my partner when we were maybe about 10 years ago called The Informant. And we called it Acoustic News Corps. Mm-hmm. So really political. So music has always been a really important part of my life. And it still is something that, it definitely kept me busy during the pandemic. So I was happy.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. I want to thank Dr. Warburton for taking the time to do this interview. Please check out their work and support their books and scholarship. Thanks to Awareness for the Music, and rest in peace to the wonderful Bill Hooks.